behalf of Reverend Jackson, we thank you for joining us today as we prepare to open up African American History Month with this legal roundtable. I thought it was just significant that we would start Black History Month with some of the legal challenges and priorities that we face for 2021. One thing, all of you are able to talk about the First Amendment and what it means to us today in light of what we've witnessed most recently. And so I would like to open up with what is really free speech in light of January 6th and how social media was used to organize the demonstration, the secessionists, the riot, the attempt to take over the Capitol.
As far as what immediately stood out to me was maybe that there was a lack of regulation or something like that around the Capitol grounds. And this is something that we have to do on a local government level, say for the parish, take our courthouse. For example, we do not allow, well, first of all, citizens have to get permits in order to protest or to be on the courthouse grounds if you're not attending to business there during business hours. And we do not allow protests or activities to be permitted while the courthouse is actually in session and being used for trials. People are going back and forth to the clerk's office, tax assessor's office, things of that nature. And so I'm wondering, particularly in light of what was going to take place on that day, even if it's not an everyday thing, why there wasn't a little bit more regulation regarding how close persons could get to the Capitol or to the Capitol doors without tickets for a tour or something to show that they were supposed to be there to conduct whatever business they were going to allow to go on in addition to the vote certification. Those kind of regulations are usually upheld as being within the government's interests and the right to protect the business that is supposed to be taking place on whatever particular piece of property it is. And so that was my first observation. My first question was, how did they even get that close?
I think we are in a moment in our nation's history where we really have to reimagine or redefine or think very carefully about truth and dishonesty and lies and people that are promoting flat out statements that are not true in public space, particularly through social media or in public speech. You know, we currently have laws on the book where you cannot defame someone's character or slander someone's character. Those are usually done in an instance where you are attacking an individual or an institution. However, that has not really been tested in the space where you have public officials that tell bold-faced lies, incite and ignite people to act in a way that is disruptive to our democracy. You know, it's one thing to give your opinion. It's another thing to be dishonest. I can give you an opinion about the Super Bowl, you know, Tom Brady versus Patrick Mahomes. That's an opinion. Who's going to win that game? But if I start going out saying that next week the Super Bowl will be played between the Chicago Bears and the Miami Dolphins, that's a bold-faced lie. It's just not true. And that should not be protected speech. And so I think those of us in the legal community really have to think about public policy and laws that make people liable for telling bold-faced lies in public space, and they cannot be allowed to hide behind the protections of the First Amendment and free speech.
You really want to regulate social media and the use of speech in social media that results in harm or deals with, inappropriately deals with our constitutional mandate. Okay, so we're going to move on to there are two big issues that everybody is thinking about. And the first one is criminal justice reform. How do we regulate police officers? We've seen the shootings live on camera. What are the legal legislative initiatives that you see need to happen? And, you know, it goes all the way back to this whole qualified immunity that police officers have in their contracts that are negotiated by the police union.
Qualified immunity is that law that protects police officers from personal liability in police brutality cases. The ABA is calling for that to be eliminated. Now, that is usually a state and local issue. And so what the ABA is calling for is that state legislatures and city councils across the country eliminate or limit very specifically qualified immunity. And so I'm very proud that the ABA did that. And that's an issue that I hope the Biden administration will champion and push to state and local governments.
I hope that the new administration in the White House builds on some of the work of the Obama administration. First, Obama, under his watch, convened a 21st century commission on policing. He also had major staff, some of whom have been brought back into the Department of Justice, to look at the jurisdictions where there have been issues with police brutality and excessive force. And they developed a host of consent decrees, many of which, or if not all of which, were abandoned under the former administration. So we need not start in the various jurisdictions where it must be addressed at baseline zero. There is a bevy of information with bright thinkers who worked on and thought about what policing should look like in the 21st century in the United States of America. We should not start from scratch. We need to pull up all of that data. We need to look at all the prior consent decrees, and we need to evaluate the extent to which they are successful or unsuccessful and move on and take the best from all of those. We need to cull from all of those the best that we can get.
I think that there are a number of things that state and local governments need to do in order to address the policing issues. This list is not exhaustive, but it is a few things at least to start. Number one, as Professor McQuarrie Smith said, rather than reinventing the wheel, I think we need to start with the standard operating procedures of police departments, and we need to go through them. We need to look at best practices. We need to pull out things that are no longer relevant and necessary, and they all should be reviewed and updated. We also need to make sure that there is better and more effective training, and the training comes from best practices, and the training can run the gamut of everything from interaction with the public to implicit biases to, again, standard safety kinds of procedures, both for the public and for the police officers, and also just basically how to communicate. And the third thing, and probably one of the most important things, is we need to figure out a way to cut through some of the existing protections that go to transparency. So for example, in New York State this past year, the governor changed, and believe it or not, it's under the civil rights law that protects the personnel records of police officers. So if you want to know how many times has Officer X been cited for inappropriate conduct or interaction with a member of the public, or how many times has an officer been alleged or have been found to have used excessive force, that information has been protected in many jurisdictions because it comes under personnel records and it's confidential. And it gets state protection. And that is something that we also need to look at, because there's a continuum here, you know, understanding what discipline is part of personnel and when it rises to a public crisis and a public's right to know.
The next area that's a hot topic is one that Ben Griffith just loves to talk about: election law, election protection. And we have a whole body of you who really want to weigh into this one because of what happened in this election and what is still happening. The lies that Attorney Thomas talked about is more than that. The actions to suppress the vote, prevent the vote, and then challenge the vote. So I'm going to open up with you, Ben, and then all of you election experts, election protection experts, I want you to just jump in.
We're dealing with residual, subtle, but highly effective voter suppression. It comes in about 20 different forms. Barbara Arnwine has written a list of 91 different types of voter suppression, and she still scratched the surface. But they come in the form of what we're going to see, hopefully remedied by HR 1 S1, the Voting Rights Restoration Act. That's going to be something, if passed, that will deal with all of these restrictions on early voting, all of these horribly racist actions by various governmental entities, including our own federal government, that sought to rein in and preclude African Americans from exercising their right to the franchise. We saw time and again efforts by different groups in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and it was embarrassing, but they were efforts that were fought back. There were 63 total cases, 90 different federal and state judges that said, in effect, every time that there was a claim made, they put forth no evidence, no proof, no summary judgment evidence, no competent expert testimony, nothing, and they were thrown out. And now the complaint is, we didn't have any of our cases adjudicated on the merits. Yes, they did. And the election cases were lined up. I think there were about 10 to 12 basic forms. Who is allowed to vote? What happens when your vote is suppressed? What are your remedies? And we've got to figure out how this Trump potion got swallowed by 74 million idiots. I'm sorry, but that's what we're dealing with. It's idiocy. How do you stop that? How do you rein it back? To me, from an election law standpoint, we've got a huge amount of work to do to rein in and neutralize the level of voter suppression.
I worry that in our concern for undoing the causes of January 6th, that we not promote actions that could be used against us, against people of color, in a different administration. We need to be very careful and walk a fine line. Cynthia Swan and I have been talking about this because she's very concerned. And there is an underlying rightist authoritarian element in this country that has been there for a very long time. And it concerns me deeply. I'm very concerned about the number of policemen and military people who were in that melee and attack on our democracy and their organization. And I sometimes wonder if it's time to reinstate the draft.
I think voter education is something that's really important. As we look around this country, you know, a lot of people don't realize that elections are administered on the state and local level. And so what we have to do is we have to, in a manner, assure that there's adequate funding to fund our elections. Because if you look at some of the bases for voter suppression, you know, I'm very fortunate to live in Fairfax County, Virginia. I don't have to wait in line that long to vote because my jurisdiction has the adequate resources to have a big enough polling place and to have the machinery. Other jurisdictions are not so fortunate. So I think that's a base cause that would at least level the playing field for people, and that's something that we need to focus on. The other thing that we need to realize is, you know, elections are the bedrock of our democracy, and we need to look at what the perception looks like when our elections do not look like they are running the right way. And so that's also something that's very important to look at. Also, Ben mentioned that we do need Shelby v. Holder. Shelby v. Holder did not undo the Voting Rights Act. What it did was it threw out the formula for pre-clearance coverage. And Ben is right. We need to work on getting that through Congress again. And what we need to realize, though, is we also need to have both sides of the aisle look at that and come together so that can become a new coverage so we can have the voting rights operate as it should.
The fact of the matter is the effectiveness or the lack thereof of our educational system really undergirds all the issues that we're talking about today. It undergirds people's understanding of their rights from the First Amendment, as well as their responsibilities to effectuate those rights in a way that does not damage our democracy. It undergirds how people enter into the criminal justice system. There's a clear connection between the achievement gap as well as school to prison pipeline, which creates some additional outcomes with their interactions with the justice system. And so one of the things that has gone completely underfunded for way too long is public education. We talk a lot about school choice. We talk a lot about lots of things that impact education, like safety, because we have lots of issues with guns in schools, but we really need to get back to talking about how do we fully fund education. And one thing that I know the Biden administration is working on is passing legislation to help schools re-engage with students because of the coronavirus pandemic. There are 3 bills that are currently on the floor: the Learning Recovery Act, the Save Education Jobs Act, and the Reopen and Rebuild the American Schools Act, that are all designed to help support, from a fiscal perspective, public education. And when we think about the achievement gap, we can tell, or there's research to establish whether a child can read on the 3rd grade. In the 3rd grade will really predict how many prisons we're building, will predict graduation rates and things of that nature. So I really think we need to think about funding education as a whole, but also funding pre-K programs for public education. Those are wildly underfunded. And if the few places where they are funded, it's through Title I funds, and it doesn't cover all the students that might have a need. The last thing I want to talk about in relation to education is technology and the digital divide. What we learned as a result of being forced to deliver instructions virtually is that there's a significant divide between people not only who have access to digital devices, but also that have access to internet connectivity as a whole. And another legislative priority that could assist in that is the modification or the expansion of the federal E-rate program. The E-rate program allows for school districts and libraries to receive discount rates for internet services. However, it does not expand enough to cover the creation and development of infrastructure where that doesn't exist. So if you think about rural education, there are tons of people, not only in urban school districts, but also in rural school districts that don't have towers to connect to the internet, that don't have the capacity to actually receive that internet connectivity and to access technology. So the digital divide is something that's going to continue to widen the achievement gap and continue to result in less than favorable educational outcomes for students.
We're going to have a different session for each one of these topics because it's so much information. The other thing we were going to talk about local government issues and legal priorities, because all politics is local. And we have not focused, I think, enough on state and local government issues. And if you look at what happened in the South, it was at the state legislative levels that all of these election issues occur. If you look at all the policing cases, the police laws are local. They're state laws that protect and provide for the appropriate or inappropriate discipline and sanctioning of police officers. The educational things, we don't have a constitutional right to a high quality public education for every child. So it's all state and local. So that's why this state and local government session is so important. I know we wanted to talk a little bit about, before we close, about mortgages and renters in this season of the pandemic. But when you have these economic challenges as well as health challenges, what happens to people who have mortgages, who've lost their jobs? What are some of the legal issues or concerns? How can we help those people?
Pretty much every state got several $1 million pushed out in rental assistance money this week. Several of your largest counties will have that money available and will be making those funds available to renters. There are going to be certain income requirements. There are going to be needs for them to show that maybe they're unemployed or they've lost income related to COVID, but the relief is coming. The flip side of that is it's coming from the federal government, who are notoriously bad with their regulations. So they really need to give a little bit more help than they're given, but that's really high level. But the funds will be there to assist some of these persons.
The only other thing I'd like to talk about briefly is the Biden administration really needs to also focus on strengthening the retaliation provisions of Title VII. Those provisions have kind of been watered down over the past several years through court decisions. Every labor and employment law has some provision to prevent retaliation. We also know from EEOC data that retaliation is one of the top areas that's always kind of brought up as an area of concern. And I would hope that the Biden administration places some focus on that, because the impact results in negative civil rights implications for workers. And even though I represent a school district, and a lot of times those claims are filed against the district, it does no one any good if those protections are watered down. So I would encourage the Biden administration to also consider that as well.
We need to get moving and remind ourselves of the lesson that we learned after the 2008 election, when we thought all was well. And we sat on our laurels, and in 2010, we got a shellacking, to quote past President Barack Obama. And so I would just want to end by simply reminding us that we have to stay engaged. And when I was honored to be president of the National Bar Association, like my dear friend Beverly McQuarrie Smith, I talked about the need to sometimes changing the lawmaker. If you want to change the law, you may have to change who makes the law. And I think we've got to remind ourselves that our democracy is not static. It's not just a given, and we have to be engaged. And so I will close by quoting my beloved Morehouse brother, who's now a US Senator from Georgia. Raphael Warnock once said, "Our enemies are defeating us by the margins of our apathy and disengagement," because our enemies are ruthless. They don't sleep, they don't stop. And we cannot be apathetic, we cannot become disengaged.
I think as far as voting rights go, equity and education are really important. And I think what we have to look at, sort of to Juan's point, if you look at voting rights, in 1776, we the people was 6% of the population, roughly 6%, which were white males who either owned property or could pay a property tax. And if you look at then a succession of amendments that sort of enhanced the right to vote and broadened it, we also, unfortunately, voting rights seems to be an area of the law where sometimes we take 2 steps forward and then we end up a step back. I would point to, as Ben mentioned, Shelby in 2018, which eviscerated the voting rights. But then I think you just have to move forward. I take, we can't rest on our laurels and we have to keep going forward. But, if you look on January 5th, Georgia elected its Jewish senator and its first African-American senator. So I think we have to look at what we can achieve, but we can't lose sight of the fact that we have to be vigilant and we have to keep moving forward, because unfortunately, this is an area of the law where so many people started well behind other people, and we just have to keep moving the line forward. And I think we will achieve through a lot of education and vigilance for voting rights. So I encourage everyone to continue to look at that and remember that even though unfortunately elections are a severely underfunded part of our government, it's really important, and we just have to keep thinking about, we cannot just think about it every 4 years or every 2 years. We have to be vigilant and cognizant of what is going on all the time.
One of the things that I wanted to share with you, Reverend Jackson has asked me to convene a national legal advisory committee. We have to communicate more frequently than we've had in the last several years. And you all have so much expertise in so many different areas that we need to know about. We need to just have these monthly conversations to talk about what's happening. We live in America, which means we live in these state and local government places, and we need to understand the housing issues, the mortgage issues, legally, where our pressure points should be. The issues are the same, but they're played out differently in each of these jurisdictions. And those of you who are the retired counsel, you didn't retire, you just shifted to another level. Nobody gets to retire from the movement. The movement continues.